Hey guys.
Yeah, alright. Just been reading my book actually. It's by Tim Winton. You know the Australian author? I was reading it over the weekend and so many Australian, it's very typically Australian. I was sort of thinking about what it would be like in a translated Chinese version because, it's sort of different. I guess they've got different attitudes to working class over there.
Definitely. I try to read one book, and I must admit there's many colloquialism very specific to the Australian society. Like those expressions do not exist in China at all. So I'm just thinking, the Chinese version will be so difficult.
Yeah, like how that sort of works. I mean, it's a very cultural aspect to be looking at for a translation. So I know that I was reading some of Turi's work in the books for class, and looks at more how the text functions as a part of the target culture. So I know he had also tried to identify some norms to take it away from, to take translation theory away from specifically one-on-one, one-to-one correspondence and equivalence, and look as as a more of a whole system. I think. What do you think about that?
Well, Turi was actually a student of Ibn Zohar, who originally proposed in the 1970s the polysystem theory. So he said that, it was particularly in reference to literary texts, that the translated literature is made up of a polysystem, which is a system of systems. So they all work together, but at the same time they're individual and independent.
Wow, and it's very descriptive.
Because we've learned scopals, and they are totally different.
Functionality of Turi looked at literature too, not so much from the functionality perspective, but looked at norms as to what they used to do in the 18th and 19th century when it was basically fashionable to transfer all of the English text over into prose from verse, so changing the style altogether.
Wow. So by that you mean they really look at the source text?
Well, polysystem theory aimed to move away from more linguistic elements and move towards cultural, historical, and literary elements, but it also focused on the target culture and what these kind of cultural things would bring to the target culture, and how to do that, how to kind of give the same thing relative to the target culture rather than focusing on the source text.
So, we could look at it from other text perspective as well. I suppose journalism, they're always focusing on promoting the news or opinions to their target culture. So, just wondering how translations work in that. I mean, I know that a lot of news organisations these days have writers that they might translate in some way, but they're also just sort of reading the basic facts and then writing it in an entirely new way for their own culture.
Yeah, especially journalism or other non-fiction texts, they really emphasize the factual fact of the text. If you add the author's opinion and then translations, analysis on culture and all that, so the final work won't be that factual or that faithful anymore. So I'm not sure if polysystem can apply to non-fiction. What do you guys think?
Some of the norms that Turi talked about, such as the low interference and low and high interference and positive and negative interference, I guess they discuss the borrowing of terms in a similar way to foreignization, but the borrowing of terms, so the word jihad in English, in Italian they've just made it really similar. And they've used a letter, a J, which doesn't exist in their regular Italian words, and so they've, I guess, just Italianized it. And
that's very interesting, because I'm just thinking an example, the English translated Chinese, by using the polysystem is an advertisement. So the brand Coca-Cola.
Oh yeah.
So I don't know, do you know what it means in English?
Coffee or caffeine? Chocolate?
Yeah, caffeine.
Cola?
Cola, it's I think it's cocaine.
Oh yeah, right.
So, considering the culture in China, especially during the 50s when they introduced Coca-Cola to Chinese market. So I would believe they try anything to avoid this kind of connotation. So the translation now actually means tasty and fun for the beverage.
Yeah.
So I think they really look at the target. I would say.
So they've adapted it to mean something that was going to work with that culture.
Yeah. It would be negative interference.
I guess more negative, yeah, because I mean I know positive's like more of a borrowing of the term, but negative's more just like literally writing something and creating something that wouldn't quite be normal. So for example, like there was some Spanish how-to manuals and that had a whole lot of verbs in them that they omitted from the published version because the way that Spanish had picked up on a lot of English verbs just sounded really weird, so they had to edit it to sort of sound different. But yeah, like the standardization is another one of Turi's norms, and he talks about how it's a tendency to generalize terms. So for example, in just even within English, like bomber, like the 2012 London bombings, there was a really quick use of the term bombers, and it kind of became really widespread. So yeah, I mean all of this stuff, like it's really quite interesting to know the decisions behind translation, because when you're actually translating it, you've got two languages and you're just working from one to the next. But if you start sort of theorising about it, you can
I would imagine with all these non-fiction texts, it will be easier because you don't really need to think about, for example, instruction, like technical texts.
Yeah, well, for the most part in technical texts, they tend to actually find someone who has the specific subject knowledge, because it's using such specialised terms and jargon that are relative to what the text type is. So manuals, user guides, how-to guides, things like that all have very particular language to the text type and also to the target culture. So they need someone who actually already has the background knowledge and has the knowledge of these terms to translate them. So kind of unlike, say, polysystems theory, it really is linguistically based and based on words rather than culture. I mean, culture still has a aspect, but it's not as high as
not as much
the
because
details
like
in the words.
How to put a chair or how to do something technical is probably not going to change a lot from one culture to the next.
There's probably not as much ambiguity, so probably focusing on the proper words and the details in the words is a bit more important than, say, in the literary text, and there's a lot more to lose as well.
The journalistic texts are different than that, because like a manual or something, you kind of want to know what it's like and it has to be really precise, but because it's a cycle of news and it's put out really quickly, whilst there would be some terms borrowed, a lot of the time I think if you're looking at how your culture or your audience is going to receive it, like if there's something that's happened in France, and maybe it's going to be more and more diluted from which country you go to, because there might not be as much knowledge of the particular areas that have been affected, or
Definitely. So it's actually polysystem for outside the literary translation is really tricky. It sometimes can apply, but yes, maybe
not necessarily.
means a contradiction, because you have this standardization, you have these norms, but it really depends the sort of text you're dealing with.
Yeah, because I guess like it depends which paradigm you're in when you discuss it, because if you start thinking about it from if you try and look at it all from descriptive translation studies, then you can lose some of the important, like all the equivalence theory was, I think it's quite useful in some ways in the word for word translations, but we could sort of theorize more and more about how certain decisions are made and what should be the way. And I know Turi was, one of his views was I like this actually, because he's like to encourage students to break norms when they were translating. So
Interesting.
So you guys going to read some more translation theory over the weekend?
Over the weekend, definitely. I'm going to finish the readings for Pim because he has very different view on this policy system. It's saying the contradictions on the policy system and the social conventions of target tax are really important. So, but yeah, so
yeah, I like that.